when you became Speaker, you talked a moment ago about the conflict with the executive over the issue of rulemaking. When you became Speaker, you pushed the legislature and gave it direction to play a much stronger role in accountability, making the executive branch accountable, if I recall. Mm-hmm. You were yourself involved very aggressively in reviewing the Civil Service Commission.
Yeah, the Civil Service Commission, we began to get a lot of complaints while I was still majority floor leader, and about the fact that they really weren't sticking to the civil service rules in terms of the way that people could apply and testing and that sort of thing.
All state employees outside the legislative branch are civil service employees. They're under that system.
Under civil services. And there's a set of rules that how you post jobs, the testing, and everything that's involved, so that you're supposed to be able to get the most qualified people as a result of that system. We began to get all kinds of telephone calls about, hey, you know, the system is not working, it's not being done that way. So after a while, I approached Frank Kelly and said, you know, maybe we ought to have a look at that. So he gave me an assistant attorney general.
The Attorney General.
The Attorney General gave me an assistant Attorney General, and we began to call people in. And sometimes we'd have to subpoena. And in the first, in the initial review, nobody seemed to want to talk hardly. Pretty soon we got a little information and they began to see that we were serious. We began to get telephone calls saying, hey, you ought to call Jerry so-and-so in. And as I said, you know, Jerry would come in and I would listen to his voice, and I knew that was Jerry that had called me. So we began to get a lot of information, and it soon appeared that they had what they call midnight exams, where they post them, you know, very quickly, and very few people would get a chance. Only the people that they wanted to see would get a chance. And then they had a band. In other words, they'd have 1, 2, 3. Maybe you finished first and I finished third in the test. Well, they had a band that said, well, if you did, you know, so within this band, I can pick anybody I want. So they'd pick me, and number 1 and 2 is out. So it was pretty much aborted. I mean, the system was not working. And the deeper we got into it, the more help we got from the people inside the system who was up to here with how it was being run.
Now, the issuing, for example, of a subpoena by the legislature was almost unheard of up to that point, wasn't
it? It was. I can't remember. I couldn't pinpoint any time when it had been used, as a matter of fact. I'm sure somewhere back it might have been. But we began to use it, and we used it several times during that process. The upshot was that the director, Sidney Singer at the time, resigned. 2 or 3 members of the board resigned, and we had an oversight committee set up to review civil service and the rules and regulations there. And that was one of the first times that we began to really use the oversight. Later on, as we discussed earlier, Wolpe Committee to look at PSC.
This was Howard Wolpe, who was the representative from Kalamazoo.
The representative from Kalamazoo, who later was a candidate for governor, as a matter of fact. And he took that committee and I think sort of did a replica of what we did with the Civil Service Commission, and did the oversight there. And that was the beginning, I think, of the legislature saying, hey, you know, we want to have a look, a little oversight. The executive branch isn't free to do whatever they want in some of these instances. And probably there's several areas today that there should be reviews, and the licensing and regulation, many things that probably the legislature ought to be doing.
Probably the oversight function of the legislature is one of those things most restricted by term limits, is it not? Because you don't have people who have a history of watching and looking at programs. So there's greater independence, if you will, of
they're not there long enough to really know any history of the issues, to know what's going on, to get the education of what these departments do and what they shouldn't do. So there's no oversight now. That's my view of it. And until it's changed, until you have people who are around long enough to develop expertise, to develop a background of the history of issues and what the function of these departments ought to be and what's actually going on there. They don't have time to do that now, so there's just obviously little or no oversight, and won't have any opportunity to have any until the term limit situation changes.
I know you're not a fan of term limits.
No.
I've heard you speak about that. Do you ever visualize what your task as Speaker would have been, how it would have been different if you had served in a term limit era?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't have had the experience that I had. When I became Speaker, I had served a term in the legislature. I had spent 4 years as Executive Secretary to the Speaker. I had served 2 years as Majority Floor Leader, and therefore I had a pretty good background in order to become Speaker. Today, poor Andy Dillon, 2 years
He's
and he
currently
became
Speaker of
Speaker.
the House, right.
So he had no opportunity to even know the rules hardly. And certainly he doesn't know his colleagues, and certainly he has no history of issues, and certainly doesn't know how the departments are operating or how they should be operating hardly, and doesn't have time to do that. So it would have been impossible for me to function as I did back then if we'd had the term limits.
You worked with some long-serving legislators. One was the chair of the Appropriations Committee, Dominic Jacobetti from the Upper Peninsula, who was always remembered as a colorful figure who was an interesting, at least, person in that role. Tell us about
I appointed him
chairman,
when he became chairman. Yeah, I appointed him when he first became chairman because Bill Copeland had been chairman of Appropriations. He got beaten in the primary by Jeffrey Padden. So therefore, when I became Speaker, the chairmanship was open. So at that time, I basically had two choices: Rusty Hellman or Dominic Jacobetti.
Both from the Upper Peninsula.
Both from the Upper Peninsula. I appointed Jake, and you're right, he was the most colorful guy in the legislature. He liked to imitate the Godfather, and he liked to perceive himself kind of as that. Jake told me when he became Speaker, or when I became Speaker and I appointed him, he said, "I'll never embarrass you." Every now and then he would slip an amendment in or something, and we'd have to go through the process, and then I couldn't find him. He'd be gone. I'd find him to chew him out, and he'd say, "Oh, it must have been one of them staff members put that in." And I'd say, "Well, look, what we find out, we're going to fire that staff member." He said, "Well, I don't know who it was exactly." Jake was the kind of guy. He was a real youper. He was a real youper. He took care of his constituents, and of course, this little saying on his pencils: If you like spaghetti, vote for Jacobetti. But he was very likable. He had a great deal of power, not as much as he thought he had sometimes, but he did. And as we went through before, we began to open up the process too. And members of the appropriation lost a little bit of their power at that time, at least, because they couldn't come to the floor with bills that most of the members didn't know what was in them. And so that process changed, but Jacobetti never changed. Jacobetti was Jacobetti. I loved him, and sometimes you hated him for a little while, yes. but you loved him again.
Yeah, there was an era there of real veterans. Jacobetti, George Montgomery, who chaired the Taxation Committee for a long time. There was another person with a lot of expertise and a lot
colorful.
What'd you say?
And colorful.
And colorful.
And
right,
colorful.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. George was one of the people that took me under his wing when I first was elected to the legislature way back in 1965, 64, 65, 66. I learned more from him about taxation and about education from anybody. He was quite the guy. I mean, he had more knowledge, and he would sit with you for hours and dispense that knowledge. I mean, ask him questions. And he had a vast amount of knowledge
Right.
in it, and he was very good.